I'm Chris Wallace. President Trump faces a growing backlash over the response to the devastation in Puerto Rico.
So I am done being polite. I am done being politically correct. I am mad as hell.
Well, I wasn't preoccupied with the NFL. The governor of Puerto Rico is so thankful for the great job that we're doing.
We'll discuss the humanitarian crisis, recovery efforts, and allegations the administration moved too slowly with FEMA Director Brock Long. Then President Trump pushes his tax plan, promising a surge in economic growth.
This can be remembered as the moment we took control of our destiny and chose a future of American patriotism, prosperity, and pride.
We are reaching across the aisle to see if there's folks who are reasonable, who want to talk about what's good for the actual American economy and American families.
We'll ask White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney whether getting tax reform passed will be any easier than repeal and replace. Plus,
I've never prayed to win this campaign. I've only prayed that God's will be done.
Roy Moore's stunning victory in Alabama's Republican Senate primary. We'll ask our Sunday panel whether the GOP is headed for a civil war in 2018. All right now on Fox News Sunday. And hello again from Fox News in Washington. President Trump travels to Puerto Rico Tuesday to see the devastation from Hurricane Maria firsthand. And it could get awkward, because this weekend the president picked fights with officials there over recovery efforts. Since the storm hit 11 days ago, much of the island has been without power, communications, and critical infrastructure. San Juan's mayor says people are dying because of the slow federal response. But the president accused the mayor and other local officials of poor leadership. In a moment, we'll discuss relief efforts with FEMA Administrator Brock Long. But first, let's bring in Mike Tobin with the situation on the ground in Puerto Rico.
Reverse. Wheels down San Juan. This DC-8, operated by the Samaritan's Purse Foundation, just navigated the traffic, bringing help to Puerto Rico.
It's very, very busy. There's a lot of relief flights coming in.
The flight carries 36 tons of aid, power generators, water filtration kits, plastic tarps, and hygiene kits. Relative to the government, Samaritan's Purse is small. They can use their own transportation and work around the bottleneck that has left thousands of containers of aid stranded at the seaport, unable to reach the people who need it.
We aren't able to cover the whole island, so we work to serve those who might have fallen through the cracks that FEMA can't cover.
86-year-old Gladys Laguerre Torre is one of those people. With no roof overhead, soaked insulation on the floor, she has no ability to even start cleaning up. She says everything is destroyed and I don't have a house. I'm going to wait to see if someone will help me. The metal roofing here is pretty similar to the construction of a mobile home, and it just didn't stand a chance when that hurricane moved so slowly and so powerfully over Puerto Rico. And the sad thing is, this is not unique. This scene is repeated over and over again through the neighborhoods here in Puerto Rico, creating tremendous need. Only 5% of power has been restored. The Army Corps of Engineers is trying to lower expectations that the lights will come back on soon. 2 hours outside of San Juan is the Oaxaca Dam, weakened by the hurricane, stressed by continued rain. Last night, Governor Ricardo Rosselló gave an order to evacuate communities below that dam, fearing it could fail. Chris, back to you.
Mike Tobin reporting from San Juan. Mike, thanks for that. Joining us now live from FEMA headquarters here in Washington is the head of that agency, Brock Long. Mr. Long, I want to start with the disconnect between what the Trump administration is saying and what the situation on the ground in Puerto Rico seems to be. Here is the acting head of the Department of Homeland Security on Thursday and the mayor of San Juan on Friday.
It is really a good news story in terms of our ability to reach people and the limited number of deaths that have taken place in such a devastating hurricane.
Damn it, this is not a good news story. This is a people are dying story. This is a life or death story.
With millions of people clearly still struggling, as we just saw in Mike Tobin's report, is it a mistake for folks in Washington to say this is a good news story?
You know what? I'm just going to say that I think the Secretary's words are being taken out of context. Look, we're not going to be satisfied until the situation is stabilized. And the bottom line is that this is the most logistically challenging event the United States has ever seen. And we have been moving and pushing as fast as the situation allows. Every day we make progress. Every day we have some setbacks. For example, you don't just bring the commodities in. You have to be able to pump them down the roadway systems that we have been working desperately to get open. We've opened up 11 major highways, but this morning there are over 3,200 different problems reported with the roadway systems, from bridges missing to road being blocked by floodwaters to roads just disappeared because of landslides. So we're having to work through all that. Not only do we have enough commodities and a massive amount of commodities coming in every day, we've also established 11 regional distribution hubs to where we have great communication with 77 mayors within Puerto Rico, where we're operating with the governor and those mayors in unified command to be able to coordinate the dissemination of these commodities. And it's not only the commodities that we're having to push forward. We're also having to work with the private sector to get them back up to speed, because this response depends far more than what FEMA can do. And the bottom line is that we're trying to get the private sector in and up and running. Over half the grocery stores, according to Governor Rosselló, and retailers are beginning to operate now at a baseline level. Over 300 pharmacies are beginning to operate over baseline level. These are signs that routine is coming back and that progress is being made. Do we have a long way to go? Absolutely, we have a long way to go.
I want to pick up on something you just said, because I'd not heard this before. You say this is the most logistically challenging relief effort ever in the history of this country?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think people have to take a step back and understand what's happened over the course of basically the last 40 days. FEMA has led the response of the federal government on behalf of governors from Texas to Florida to North Carolina to South Carolina to Georgia to the Virgin Islands. And the bottom line is that we've registered almost 3 million people for disaster assistance, and most likely many of those were uninsured, and we've been able to get well over $1 billion in their hands to support. It's not only a logistically complex event just getting to the islands and being able to support an island that was hit not just by one major hurricane but two within basically a 10-day period. The bottom line is you can only shove so much into an island pre-storm, because if you push in too much stuff, the storm may damage it. So we had to pull back not only equipment and staff, because we don't want to soak up vital shelter space. We want to continue to push forward after the fact and move more equipment in. The ports were damaged. The airports were damaged. This morning, someone was saying we're not seeing relief flights into San Juan. We're not using San Juan near to the degree we were. Our goal was to open up incident support bases in other airports, and we have 3 of those operating so that commercial flights can come back up in San Juan. So the problem and the frustration is the way information is being misrepresented across the board. I don't have time for that. What we have time for is being laser focused to help Puerto Ricans, and that's what we're doing.
I do want to pick up a little bit on the question of misinformation, because some people would say it's not surprising that you're having trouble, but that isn't being reflected here in Washington. And so you have this disconnect between statements, claims of great news in Washington, and, as you say, an understandable, but nevertheless a really tough situation continuing 11 days after in Puerto Rico. If I may, I just want to pick up on this, and the president in particular. Between September 19th, the day before Hurricane Maria hit, and last Sunday, he sent 2 tweets on Puerto Rico and 12 on sports and the controversy over the national anthem. And yesterday, after Mayor Cruz complained about the response, the president tweets this: "The mayor of San Juan, who was very complimentary only a few days ago, has now been told by Democrats that you must be nasty to Trump. Such poor leadership ability by the mayor of San Juan and others in Puerto Rico who are not able to get their workers to help." I know you don't have much patience for this politics, but frankly, it was the president who started talking politics.
Right. So what I don't have patience for is the fact that what we're trying to do and what we have successfully done is we've established a joint field office within San Juan. And you should go there. You should go see that operation where we're having daily conversations with all the mayors. We're working with the governor and his leadership to be able to create unified objectives. If mayors decide not to be a part of that, then the response is fragmented. And the bottom line is that we're pushing everybody.
Let me ask you directly,
sir. In there.
I was going to say, is Mayor Cruz not participating in the FEMA effort?
You know, there was a good article that aired this morning in the Washington Examiner, and Mayor Otero out of Guaynabo, if I'm not pronouncing that correct, is basically saying, look, there's been excellent communication with not only the governor but also FEMA and the way that we're trying to tackle this. You know, we can choose to look at what the mayor spouts off or what other people spout off, but we can also choose to see what's actually being done. And that's what I would ask.
FEMA got high marks for how you responded to the hurricanes in Texas and in Florida. Is part of the reason that you've had problems? I understand the logistics. An island is different than just shipping stuff across a state. But is part of the reason that you've had more problems and more pushback in terms and lower marks in terms of Puerto Rico because the first responders, and we all learned this after Katrina, the first responders are not FEMA, it's state, in this case Commonwealth and local officials, that they weren't as prepared as they were in Texas and Florida?
Well, Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands both, it's different than what goes on in the continental United States. I mean, in some cases, you know, the infrastructure was incredibly fragile. That's not an excuse, but the reality is that the infrastructure was incredibly fragile. And then you also have to understand that both of these territories were hit by two major hurricanes, two, not just one. So a lot of the infrastructure was damaged, you know, by Irma, and then Maria comes in and finishes it off completely. So by the time you go back in after Maria, a lot of the local responders, a lot of the local officials, a lot of the citizens have disaster fatigue. The capacity is diminished, not from a disrespecting standpoint of local leadership, but from a truly, they've taken a big hit. And the bottom line is that a majority of the response, an overwhelming majority of the response, is on the federal shoulders. So, you know, when we're trying to push in and push forward, you know, we have nearly 13,000 people working in both island territories right now, trying to do everything that they can to push forward and push forward. And that capacity grows every day. But there are, you know, more and more success stories coming out where, you know, we provided fuel the other day to over 700 different gas stations. We know that there's 1,100 gas stations roughly on the island. But, you know, we've gotten 700 of them back up and running. And if you notice, there are cars driving around in some cases. You know, there were 16 deaths confirmed right now. My USAR teams have been all over Puerto Rico, even into some of the roughest areas. That's not to say that number won't climb, but in Katrina, there were over 1,800 deaths. And so I think we have to put a lot of this stuff, we have to filter out the noise, and we have to continue to push forward. My guys back here have been busting their rear ends day in and day out for almost 40 days now to help Americans. And it's been incredibly complex. There's not a person in this country that would change jobs with me right now.
I got about 30 seconds left. Can you give us a projection to the folks that are down there in Puerto Rico a week from now, 2 weeks from now? How much improved will things be?
Weeks from now? Well, you know, the key is it's a couple factors. Right now, you know, many days ago, we mission assigned the Army Corps of Engineers to do one very important job, emergency power, but also begin rebuilding the grid. So getting power back is obviously the most important thing. In conjunction with that, we're trying to work with the private sector to get telecommunications back up. The governor is reporting this morning that about a third of the telecommunications has been put back up. After two major hurricanes and all the equipment that was damaged, telecommunications is about a third, you know, back up and running. So we have to get the power up, we have to get communications back up, and then the bottom line is that takes a long time because it was almost a total loss when it comes to the power grid. And so it's going to be multiple months before power is restored to many of these areas. And that's just the reality. That's what we were saying before the storm hit. And I think that people have to remember that. Going into this storm, we were setting expectations by saying this is going to be a nightmare for Puerto Rico.
Mr. Long, thank you. Thanks for your time. And in addition to relief efforts, you also got to deal with the politics here in Washington. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Up next, we'll bring in our Sunday group to discuss the situation in Puerto Rico and also the resignation of HHS Secretary Tom Price over his use of chartered flights on the taxpayer's dime.
We've saved a lot of lives. We've done a really good job, and now we're bringing the people for distribution.
We are dying, and you are killing us with the inefficiency and the bureaucracy.
President Trump and the mayor of San Juan painting drastically different pictures of the situation in Puerto Rico. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Josh Holmes, Mitch McConnell's former chief of staff and a GOP strategist. Charles Lane of the Washington Post. Former Democratic Congresswoman Donna Edwards. And the head of Heritage Action for America, Michael Needham. Well, Congresswoman Edwards, you could hear the frustration and the exhaustion in Brock Long's voice. He makes some good points. It's obviously a lot tougher providing all these resources, one to an island and also an island where a lot of the roads on that island have been wiped out. How fair do you think the criticism of the administration's response is? And what do you make of the President Trump's tweets over the weekend?
Well, first of all, I think we have to realize that Puerto Rico was already in a very fragile economic state and its services. And I think that combined, I understand Brock Long's point, but I also understand the mayor of San Juan. And I think anytime you have a crisis like this, which is a real humanitarian crisis, it's an infrastructure crisis, that you would expect that there would be different vantage points through which people would see that. And unfortunately, I think with the president, he continues to punch down. I mean, there's not I mean, you understand the mayor's frustration. There's no reason for him to have tweeted like that, and also implying that the people of Puerto Rico are like lazy and not paying attention to their own needs. I don't understand the president punching down. I think that he should seek higher ground, and he could do that by continuing to just lend the support and just get the job done on the ground.
Michael.
Yeah, I mean, look, we know that this is a president. When he gets punched, he's going to punch back, and whether he should have in this instance or not is a completely separate subject from the response to this hurricane. The reality, as the Congresswoman just said, this is a small island. It was hit by a hurricane and then hit directly by a major hurricane. Communications were put down. Kind of even knowing what needs to get in was challenging for FEMA. I think they did a fantastic job. They are doing a fantastic job. And in the light of a tragedy, and one that we all need to come together and figure out how to deliver both compassion and relief to the people of Puerto Rico, that's where the focus should be on. And there have been, not necessarily from the mayor of San Juan, but there have been a lot of opportunistic attacks on what has been an incredibly difficult and tragic situation, where I think you saw from the FEMA administrator somebody who's doing the absolute best he can.
I certainly agree with that, but do you think it's a mistake, and you haven't heard this for the FEMA administrator, but from the president and from the acting head of DHS, for them to say things are great, we're doing well, when obviously it isn't? Is that just a mistake and obviously adding to the frustration in Puerto Rico?
Sure. It's obviously adding to the frustration. I think similarly, the president, the head of DHS, and I think you just saw the FEMA administrator, are frustrated at opportunistic attacks when they're doing absolutely everything they can. There was one person who said recently, why didn't they pre-position support and relief efforts in Puerto Rico? Well, where do you pre-position things in an island that's about to get hit by a major hurricane? And so I think there is a frustration from people who are making attacks on them that aren't grounded in the reality of an incredibly difficult logistical situation, and that's causing all sorts of people to say things that they probably shouldn't say.
I want to turn to another story, and that's the resignation late on Friday of HHS Secretary Tom Price after revelations that he spent close to $1 million on either private planes or government chartered planes in dozens of flights in just the few months he's been HHS Secretary. President Trump was not happy. Here he is.
I felt very badly because Secretary Price is a good man, but we are looking into it, and we're looking into it very strongly.
And Price is not alone. EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke, and VA Secretary David Shulkin have all flown on private or government planes at taxpayer expense. Chuck, how big a deal is this, and how about the fact, as Republicans point out, that various Democrats, when they were in positions of power, did the same thing?
How big a deal is it? I think if we didn't have this big story about Puerto Rico and the NFL and all the other things, this would have been an even bigger story, because it does go right to that perception of the Trump administration, to some extent created by the president himself and his heavy expenditures on Secret Service protection and the travel back and forth to New Jersey, that they're a little loose with the taxpayers' dime when it comes to their own personal comfort. I think it's very significant that the president, axed Tom Price with such speed, because it shows that there was, in a sense, there was some price, pardon the pun, to be paid for what happened on health care. If Secretary Price had really, performed a lot more dynamically and done a more impressive job in trying to get through that health care bill, he might have had more of a purchase on the president's loyalty, which we know is a fleeting thing to begin with. But this firing is also about the fact that the president was upset about what happened on health care, and that's also part of the story and part of the reason it went down so quickly.
Josh, isn't this part of what voters hate about D.C., the idea that public officials are living large on the taxpayer's dime? And I want you to pick up or say whether you agree or not that this wasn't just about the flights in the case of Price, but also the fact that he failed, or at least wasn't seen as being a big player in trying to push Obamacare repeal and replace across the finish line.
Yeah, no, I think there's a good rule in government these days, which is if it feels good, don't do it. Right? And in this case, flying across the country and Gulf Streams and everything certainly feels good, and that certainly qualifies as something you don't do. Look, we're at a very populous time, and I think the American people, when you think about traveling of government officials, what they think of is, I'm not going to be happy until they're sitting middle seat next to the bathroom. And the reality is that Secretary Price took this way too far. $1 million of private flights, none of which seem to justify that kind of expense from my perspective. But I think Charles is right. I think this has a lot more to do with his overall standing within the administration and how they felt like the repeal and replace effort was managed from a department point of view.
I'm going to, Michael, in the little bit of time we have left, go post-Price, because with the failure of repeal and replace, one of the things that the administration hopes to do is either through regulations or executive orders undo some of Obamacare. One, say what you will about Tom Price, he knew the system pretty well. Is it going to be harder to do that with Price out? And how hard is it going to be to get a new HHS secretary with the battle lines already formed on health care?
Yeah, I mean, Tom Price obviously knew the healthcare system. There's many people who know the healthcare system. I don't think they'll have trouble getting somebody through. The core problem is that most of Obamacare is statutory regulatory authority given to Washington, taken from the American people, taken from the states, and given to Washington. The Republican Party spent 8 years saying it wants to repeal that regulatory authority. What we've learned over the last 9 months is that's actually not true. There's probably 15 or 20 out of 52 senators who want to repeal Obamacare. The challenge President Trump is going to have is finding a way, once we move past tax reform, to get the Republican Party to congeal around a plan that follows through on promises that they would make to repeal Obamacare, which, frankly, the vast majority of elected Republicans don't actually believe in.
Real quickly, one quick answer. You got a candidate for HHS secretary?
I don't. I think you could look at somebody like Ron Johnson in the Senate, who obviously knows health care very well. There's many people on the outside, but I don't have just one name.
All right. It's early. It's just the weekend. Man, that's the way Washington works, right? He's out. Who's going to replace him? Thanks, panel. We'll see you a little later. When we come back, seeking a win after the failure to repeal Obamacare, President Trump rolls out the Republican plan to cut taxes. We'll discuss it with White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney. That's next. President Trump unveiled the Republican plan for overhauling the tax code this week, calling it a once-in-a-generation opportunity. But there are already serious questions about who benefits from the plan and how much it will add to the deficit. We want to discuss that now with the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Mick Mulvaney. Before we get to Tax Reform Director Mulvaney, I want to ask you about the Tom Price travel controversy, because you sent out this memo on Friday to all executive agency heads saying that they now need prior approval from the White House Chief of Staff to fly on a government or private plane. And you added this: every penny we spend comes from the taxpayer. Just because something is legal doesn't make it right. Question, why did you feel the need to write that?
I thought it was the clearest way to articulate what the president believes, and one of the reasons, or at least the reason behind why the president was so upset about what happened with Mr. Price. By the way, I got that memo from the lawyers, and it was fairly sanitary. It was very legalese, and those are the two sentences that I added just to make it explicitly clear that this is the policy. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's right. My guess is, and there's ongoing investigations in a couple of different administration agencies right now, we'll find out that all of this travel was entirely legal. The question is whether or not it's right, and I think that's the lens that the president wants to look at this travel through, not just whether or not it follows the law.
Well, as I discussed with the panel, Tom Price isn't alone. I want to put these pictures up on the screen again. At least 3 other members of the cabinet, as well as the head of the EPA, have all taken either private and/or government flights. They say they needed to get where they were going in a hurry, and they got approval from their agencies. Are they in trouble?
Let's be clear, there are absolutely times where this type of travel is appropriate. I think if you look at some of the places specifically that Secretary Zinke went, there is no commercial service there. In fact, there's no commercial service anywhere near where he was going, and I think that was the case in many of the occasions. The question is just this, is that are we doing the best that we can to be good stewards of the taxpayer dollars? Are these particular choices, the private charters, the military flights, are those the absolute last options that we go through or get to? And I think that's what you'll see. It was unfortunate what happened with Dr. Price, but the president is telling everybody it's not going to happen again.
Well, let me ask you a direct question, because you're now at a conference in Canada where we're talking to you from. Please tell me that you flew commercial.
Not only did I fly commercial, I paid for it myself. It's not a conference. I'm up here visiting a college with my son.
Oh, okay. I had that wrong. So that's all self-funded.
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Let's turn to the tax reform plan that the president and Republicans in Congress rolled out this week. The president told Americans who benefits.
By eliminating the tax breaks and special interest loopholes that primarily benefit the wealthy, our framework ensures that the benefits of tax reform go to the middle class, not the highest earners.
But Director Mulvaney, independent experts say what the president just said there isn't true. I want to put up this chart. The Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center did this analysis. It shows the middle fifth of households in America, those earning between $48,000 and $86,000 a year. They'll get an average tax cut of $660 next year. Meanwhile, the top 1%, people making more than $730,000 a year, will get an average tax cut of almost $130,000 next year. Now, I understand that this isn't done yet, that they're only basing it on the plan as it exists at this point. But according to their analysis, that middle fifth gets 1.5% of the total benefit of the tax cut, while the top 1% gets 8.5% of the benefit. That doesn't seem fair.
Sure, a couple of different things, and obviously I can't see the graph that you just put up, but I think that I have seen it previous to this, and what I think that particular organization did was, number one, they didn't do any dynamic scoring. If you go look at the details of what they put out, they assumed no benefit to the overall economy, which is just absurd to think that there won't be any
But I'm not talking,
economic
sir, I'm not talking about the economy. I'm talking about the benefit to the individual family.
Let me finish.
The tax cut they get.
I got it, but let me go through. You can't look at the tax cut on a family until you realize how much better off they're going to be in a growing economy. But beyond that, they had to make assumptions because we didn't put any in the framework yet about where those particular tax rates kick in. There's nothing in the document yet about that, not because we're hiding it, but because we're working with Congress to try and establish where the different rates kick in. Keep in mind, there's 4 rates. There's 0% rate, and we know that will go up to $24,000. After that, it's 12, 25, and 35. But there's been absolutely no decisions made yet on where those percentages kick in terms of the tax brackets. It's impossible to do what the National Tax Center just did. So my guess is, and I think that's the one that Jared Bernstein works for, it's not surprising that the former chief economist for a Democrat vice president doesn't like a Republican tax plan. So I don't put very much weight on that particular study.
It's a nonpartisan group, first of all, sir. And secondly, I mean, you can talk about, well, it's going to kick in at this level or that level, but if the middle income person is getting a $600 tax cut and the top 1% is getting a $130,000 tax cut, I mean, I thought the whole point was that the wealthy weren't going to get a tax cut at all.
It was, and I'm laughing because I was on one of your. I've done a couple of these interviews this week, Chris, and I was on one of your sister networks, and they were accusing the tax plan of not giving any tax cuts to the wealthy. In fact, they were accusing it of raising the taxes on the wealthy. And then I was on another network, and they were accusing the tax plan of giving all of the benefit to the wealthy. So it sounds like the beauty's in the eye of the beholder at this point. And the real details are this: is that we're looking at the middle class in terms of making sure they can pay less. And this doesn't get nearly enough attention, it's easier for them to pay. Almost 90% of American families, not businesses, but families, actually pay someone else to do their taxes. So there's another benefit we're trying to give to them. The second thing we're trying to add to this is that lower corporate tax rate as we try and spur the economy. So that's where the president's attention is. The president's attention is on the middle class, making sure that's simple, fair, and better, and then on the corporate tax rate to try and get folks to invest in America again. His focus has not been on the impact on the top 1%.
All right, now let's get to the other issue you were discussing, and I interrupted you, and forgive me for that, and that is the issue of cost, because the Senate Republican budget plan calls for a tax cut that is going to cost the Treasury $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. And some outside experts say that the plan that was unveiled this week actually will add $2 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years. Now, back when you were in Congress, you were a deficit hawk. What happened, sir?
Yeah, and I think that $2 trillion number is coming from that same organization that did not score this dynamically, didn't look at the potential for economic growth.
That's coming from a bunch of different groups.
It does, but let's talk about it because I've been very candid about this. We need to have new deficits because of that. We need to have the growth, Chris. If we simply look at this as being deficit neutral, you're never going to get the type of tax reform and tax reductions that you need to get to sustained 3% economic growth. We really do believe that the tax code is what's holding back the American economy. The reason we've been growing at 1.8% for the last 8-10 years, which is way below the historical average, is in large part because of our tax code. It is important to us to get the biggest, broadest tax reduction, tax cut, tax reform that we can possibly get, because it's the only way we get back to 3% growth. That's what's driving all of this. How do you get the American economy back on the historical growth rate of 3% and out of these doldrums of 1.8, 1.9 that we had under the previous administration?
I want to pick up on this because some of your fellow colleagues in the Trump administration are not just saying that it's going to unleash massive growth. They are saying more than that. Here is Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin this week.
That's $2 trillion of additional revenues. That's $10 trillion of economic activity. And not only will this tax plan pay for itself, but it will pay down debt.
But the fact is, there is no evidence that tax cuts pay for themselves. The Reagan tax cut back in 1981 added $208 billion to the deficit over 4 years. The Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003 added $1.5 trillion to the debt over 10 years. Mr. Mulvaney, you can argue whether or not tax cuts spur economic growth. I think that's a perfectly legitimate argument. There is no evidence that they pay for themselves.
Well, just look at the facts, and you can go back, Chris, and make an assumption, and you can run some numbers. You have to make a couple of assumptions about growth rates and so forth. But if we had 3% growth, which is what we're trying to get to, and what we're at, by the way, right now, we're trying to maintain that 3% growth. If we had been at 3% growth over the last 10 years, the budget very nearly would be balanced this year. That's how big a difference it makes when you grow the American economy, that additional 1% over 10 years. Over the next 10 years, if we can grow at 3% instead of the 1.8% that the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says that we're going to grow at, and has been the average under the previous administration, if we can get to that 3%, it is $2 to $2.5 trillion worth of more government revenues. It's 12 million additional jobs, and those are 12 million jobs paying into Medicare, 12 million jobs paying into Social Security. Growth really is what's driving all of this, and growth is what our focus is, which is why we're willing to accept increased short-term deficits in exchange for that long-term payoff.
But, I mean, that's the point I want to make, and you seem to be agreeing with me. Growth is a great thing, and there's no question tax cuts can produce growth, although it isn't just tax cuts. In fact, in the 90s, Bill Clinton had a tax increase, and we had the biggest growth we've had in any decade in recent history. So, I mean, there are a lot of other factors, I think you would agree, other than government fiscal policy. But the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for Ronald Reagan said that the benefit, the payback from a tax cut is 35 cents on the dollar. So in other words, he's saying if you cut taxes $1, you add 65 cents to the debt.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that math. In fact, I'm sitting here trying to think of how to respond to it. But in any event, there are a lot of other fiscal policies that we have put in place already, Chris, and I don't want to draw attention away from the regulatory reform that we've done. And by the way, why do I talk about these things? We're at 3% already. I think I was on your show a couple months ago, and you had criticisms from some of the same groups saying there was no way that we would get to 3% ever during this administration, and here we are already in the first 8 months. Growth works. What we're doing in the administration to spur growth in terms of regulatory reform work. And what we're working on right now is to make sure that those tax cuts add to that. We do believe that sustained 3% economic growth is possible, and that is the way you can balance the budget long term. Without 3% growth, Chris, you'll never balance the budget at 1.8% growth again. And as the budget director, you asked me an opening question, what happened to me? Why am I now interested in deficits? The only way you balance the budget in this country long term is through sustained economic growth, and that's why everything we are doing in this administration is aimed at that end goal.
Director Mulvaney, thank you. Thanks for sharing part of your weekend with us, especially on a college trip with your son. We'll track the progress of the tax package in Congress. Thanks again, sir.
Thanks, Rice.
Up next, Roy Moore's victory over a candidate backed by President Trump in Alabama's Senate primary sets off talk of a Republican civil war.
People of Alabama know me and they understand what I stand for, and I certainly support President Trump's agenda, and that, yes, I'm an outsider, not part of the establishment.
Judge Roy Moore is saying he supports the president but not Republican congressional leaders after beating their candidate, Luther Strange, in this week's closely watched Alabama Senate primary. And we're back now with the panel. Well, Josh, we mentioned earlier that you used to be the chief of staff to Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader. And most observers read Moore's victory as a slap at McConnell and the establishment, the party leaders in Congress, and a sign that the populist movement that propelled Donald Trump to victory isn't done. Are they right?
Well, I think it's a lot more complicated than that. And, you know, this whole effort's being led by Mr. Bannon, who, of course, was at the right hand of the president for the better part of the last 8 months and didn't accomplish a whole lot. And so, you know, 8 months later after he's fired, it's got to be somebody else's fault. And so what he's done is his first target is go down to Alabama and target somebody who has a 100% voting record with President Trump's agenda and Luther Strange, and replace him with somebody, quite frankly, who's already said that he wouldn't support Graham Cassidy, which is the repeal and replace measure supported by this president. And when you have some trouble voting for a budget that ultimately you need to vote for the tax reform package. So it's unclear what they're trying to accomplish here. It certainly isn't in support of making America great again, as far as the president sees it. It seems like it's more like...
Would you agree? Because Mitch McConnell was one of the targets of the Moore campaign and the whole idea of the Senate leadership. I mean, Mitch McConnell was seen as a detriment to the party and an advantage to Roy Moore.
Well, it's going to come as a great surprise to Roy Moore and everybody else that the one person who's working as hard as he can possibly work to accomplish the Trump agenda is Mitch McConnell, and there's no separation between the president and McConnell on that. If they're going to focus on something, honestly, on the legislative side, we've had this Never Trump caucus of legislators, 4 or 5 of them, that each and every time we're talking about either repeal and replace or now maybe tax reform, they're frankly not quite on board yet. And if we're talking about somebody to target, you know, I think that's the right spot.
Michael, you're, I think it's fair to say, from the more insurgent wing of the party. At Moore's victory party on Tuesday night, the aforementioned Steve Bannon said they're not done yet. Here he is.
The question was called today in the state of Alabama. Who's sovereign, the people or the money? And Alabama answered today, the people.
How much trouble are Mitch McConnell and his colleagues in?
Well, I think Josh's answer right there shows you everything that's wrong with the Republican Party right now. There is always, from the Republican establishment, somebody else who is to blame for the problems that this party has right now. It's Steve Bannon. 4 years ago, briefly, it was me. At the core of the problem right here is that the Republican Party primarily is speaking for its donor class right now. Its donor class thinks that economic opportunity is going great in America. The donor class thinks that social issues and issues of American identity are a problem. The donor class is very good at navigating Washington, D.C. That's not what Republican voters are feeling right now. Republican voters are economically anxious in a world of globalization. Republican donors think that Washington, D.C. is deeply corrupt and inaccessible to them. Republican voters think that most of our nation's elites think of themselves as more citizens of the world than citizens of this great country. We are not going to be healthy as a party until the Republican establishment, the leadership of the Republican Party, starts to understand that there are real and legitimate concerns which keep popping up and costing Eric Cantor their seat, make Donald Trump the President of the United States, get Roy Moore elected in Alabama. Similarly, my side of the aisle, we have to understand institutions matter. We need to have a functioning Republican Party. We need to have functioning senatorial committees and campaign committees within that party. But until the Republican establishment says that the voters of this party have the right to be told the truth and have a seat at the table, and we come together and work together, we're going to keep having this. And Josh seems to fundamentally misunderstand that.